Now, when you use provision capacity, you might run the risk of throttling errors if you consume more capacity than what you have provisioned. But again, I say you might run into such errors, and you don't often run into such errors because DynamoDB comes to your rescue. There are two features in DynamoDB that help you accommodate occasional bursts in capacity. The first one is DynamoDB burst capacity, and second one is adaptive capacity. So let's look at what DynamoDB burst capacity is. So here we have a graph that shows what you have provisioned. The horizontal red line shows what you have provisioned, and the curve is showing your consumption graph. All right, so there are times when you are underutilizing your provision capacity, and there is one instance where you are exceeding your provisioned capacity. So the DynamoDB burst capacity comes to your rescue here, and it helps you accommodate occasional bursts in your consumption. So the way it works is DynamoDB preserves about 5 minutes or 300 seconds worth of your unused read and write capacity. So you can see the shaded portion here. This is what is your unused capacity. So DynamoDB uses this as the potential for your burst capacity. So 300 seconds of unused provisioned capacity is stored for future use, and it gets utilized whenever you exceed your provisioned capacity. So the spike you see here, that's where the burst capacity can get used, so you don't see throttling errors. But remember that this burst capacity can get consumed very quickly, and your application must not rely on the DynamoDB burst capacity. The second such feature that helps you accommodate occasional bursts in traffic is the DynamoDB adaptive capacity. Here you can see that we have 3 partitions. DynamoDB data is always stored in different partitions. One partition is about 10 gigs in size. So 10 gig SSDs are used to store DynamoDB data, and we're going to talk about that later. But for now, remember that whatever capacity you provision to your table is equally divided between all the available partitions used by your table. So in this example, we have 3 partitions, P1, P2, and P3. Let's say we have provisioned about 600 WCUs per second on this table. So each of the 3 partitions is going to receive a third, that is about 200 WCUs each. So the provisioned capacity line is at 200 WCUs. And the blue portion, you can see that is the consumed capacity for each partition. So we can see here that the application is sending more requests, more write requests on the partition P2, while partition P1 and P3 are not being utilized as much. So what happens is DynamoDB looks at the unused capacity in different partitions. So for example, we see that about 100 WCUs of capacity is unused in partition P1 and partition P3. Then this unused capacity can then be utilized by other partitions which are consuming more than what has been provisioned for those partitions. So in this case, partition P2 is kind of a hot partition because it's using more than what is provisioned for it. So it's using about 400 WCUs when it only has about 200 WCUs provisioned. So that difference of 200 WCUs can be accommodated from the unused capacity of partitions P1 and P3. So the hot partitions can really consume the unused portions, and this is what is called as adaptive capacity. So DynamoDB comes to your rescue here, and It gathers the unused capacity from other partitions and helps the hot partitions to really use more than their provisioned capacity. But if the unused capacity runs out, then your application is going to result in throttling. So any consumption beyond this unused capacity is going to result in throttling. So what you see in dark red here, that's where your application is going to return throttling exceptions, provisioned capacity exceeded exception. And this is very useful for non-uniform workloads like the hot partitions. So one partition is using more than the other. So that's where adaptive capacity comes into play, and it's really useful, and it works automatically, but there are no guarantees. So your application again must not rely on adaptive capacity or the burst capacity. But just know that these features are available and they come into play automatically, but your application should still make right choices like using auto scaling or on-demand mode to get the best performance from your DynamoDB table. All right.